Welcome back. In part 2, Aaron and I look at different related threads that one encounters when delving into this topic. In particular, how Aaron's research ties into a topic that I had talked about last year with regard to the recent documentary-type show called Hellier, specifically with regard to a man named Allen Greenfield. And this, of course, links to high strangeness, such as with the Mothman Prophecies, but also ritual magic, and it's just occulture at its finest, in my opinion. We try to make some sense out of all of this and ask how it all relates to the original case study of Steiner and Hynek. And then we shift our attention to talk about the challenges that a researcher within academia faces when trying to explore topics that are considered quote-unquote controversial, as well as backlash that a researcher might experience from the people being researched. Another thing about this us from the future trope, I guess what we're kind of already talking about here is that there are so many different related threads that one encounters when getting into this stuff. And one thing that came up in discussion at Trans States after your presentation, and actually throughout the rest of the conference, was this UFO connection with this show called Hellier. And yeah, here we get into another rabbit hole. There's a connection there through a particular character that the team, it's called Hellier. It's in reference to a place in Kentucky, the city called Hellier. There's a team of people who are, for the show's purposes, they are investigating all different types of high strangeness. And in this documentary called Hellier, the team encounter a person through electronic communications that calls themselves Terry Wriste. And the last name is spelled W-R-I-S-T-E. So Terry Wriste. And they, of course, they didn't know who this guy was, so they Googled his name, and come to find out, Terry Wriste, the only Terry Wriste that they could ever hit on in the Google returns was this person that's from a John Keel story about the alien Indrid Cold that was found in John Keel's book, The Mothman Prophecies. So I mentioned this to you when we were talking, and I said, have you ever heard of Hellier? And you're like, no. But then you said, well, have you ever heard of somebody called Allen Greenfield? And I was like, yeah, through Hellier. So I can't remember how it was that you heard about Allen Greenfield. So if you could refresh my memory on that, and then maybe we can try to pick this whole thing apart, because there was some stuff that you wanted to talk about this as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And this is quite interesting. We're now sort of jumping to the next phase of this. We're exploring some of the historical links between, what are we interested in here? We're interested in esotericism and ufology, which is what my talk was about.
Yeah.
Either one of those fields, when you try to study it, is a whole minefield of it's very difficult, both of these. So now we're trying to bring them together, which is double difficulties. But there's clearly a connection. I think we are establishing this.
Yeah.
It might seem obvious to some people that there's a connection, but even if it's obvious to some, it's not obvious to others, and it certainly hasn't been written about enough in an academic way, or studied enough in this way. So I think that's like what we're getting on, and now we're shifting to a very sort of contemporary example of this, which has historical roots within some of these same groups we were just talking about. And so it's funny because I had come across the book, The Complete Secret Cipher of the Euphonauts.
Right.
That's how I knew about it. And I came across it a long time ago, actually. And because I like weirdness, I'm also an editor of weird fiction. I write weird fiction. So anything weird catches my eye. Weird is a synonym for good. also
Yeah.
for me. So it's like, this,
Yeah.
it doesn't mean I then, accept whatever it is or something, but that's where my attention goes because
Yeah.
that's what is for me interesting.
Understood.
Yeah, and so that's why I had come across this book, and I remember reading it. It was also like, this is a long time ago. It was also around the time I was starting to learn about Crowley and Thelema, and I do remember thinking like, well, and there were those movies, The Men in Black, with Will Smith and blocking out people's memories with little web technologies and things.
Right.
Yeah, so all of that was interesting to me. I remember I actually couldn't read the book. I read some of it. It was a little bit beyond what I was looking at the time, I guess. But I was just sort of interested more in what was being said and the whole approach of the thing. And the approach of the thing was to take something like this Men in Black UFO narrative, and then it was totally linked together and explained through esotericism, more specifically through Thelemic, through a Thelemic perspective. And I remember finding that interesting, and that was sort of about it. He popped up once in a while on other maybe podcasts talking about magic or something that I'd heard, but the reason why I sort of remembered it was this book. I did find that interesting, that book. I think a lot of people who are interested in weirdness probably have come across this book, because to put those two things together is a weird project,
Yeah.
I knew the Hellier show, actually. I just sort of knew it a little bit. Like I had watched some of the first one whenever it came out. I hadn't followed up much on it, and of course I don't remember the premise exactly. I did remember reading somewhere, though, that it turned out that it was a hoax, or I don't know exactly the story, but I was not aware that they had brought the Secret Ciphers of the UFOnaut author on there to do what exactly. I mean, I was just watching some of this, that he was somehow explaining to them what it all means.
Do you want me to do like a little recap of
that? Would be excellent, actually, yeah.
So, because maybe the listeners listening to this now don't know that I did a earlier podcast episode about Hellier, and I did an episode, it was episode 7. I called it To Warm Up to Hellier, to kind of give like a little background of what the show was all about and how these esoteric / occult thoughts came into this whole story of, this team investigating high strangeness. So I'm looking at my notes here that I made out for that show. I mentioned the guy, Terry Wrist. Terry Wrist contacted the investigative team, the Hellier team, and they Googled the name because they didn't know who this guy was. They couldn't find any information about him. And he came up as a reference to this book by Allen Greenfield that you mentioned, The Secret Cipher of the UFOnauts. There was a second book that he also wrote called The Secret Rituals of the Men in Black. And then those two books were kind of compiled into another volume called The Complete Secret Cipher of the UFOnauts. So that's kind of how that all came about with the Men in Black as well. So then the Hellier team was like, well, who's Allen Greenfield? Who's this guy? They had never heard of him before either, because these people are not occultists. They're not involved in all this stuff. They don't know anything about anything. So this is all brand new to them. So they find out that Greenfield is a ufologist, but he's also an occultist, and he is a practicing ceremonial magician, and he was associated with the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, at one time. But he, of course, has ties to Aleister Crowley and Thelema through the OTO and through the ritual magic that he practices. He says what his goal is to, quote, interpret the lore of ufology for occultists, end quote, and vice versa. So his book about the secret cipher, it was based upon concepts that are used within Thelema regarding gematria. And in the show Hellier, I'm not going to go into great detail, there are a lot of numbers that are important in this show, and they're trying to figure out what the cipher means. And Allen Greenfield was trying to explain to them how this gematria system works and how this all, how they can come to find meaning in these numbers that they keep finding. let me see. I'm just looking through my notes here, so pardon my pausing. I'm gonna skip ahead because I have a lot of information here that this is, if you want to know about it, you can listen to the other podcast episode because I really go into more detail there. Okay, so Greenfield thinks that people like Blavatsky from the Theosophical Society, Aleister Crowley, and some members of even the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, as well as the OTO, have a connection to ufology. And this would make sense because what we're talking about with Steiner, about these, Steiner was also talking about ascended beings that, from different places outside of the cosmos, or from, not on Earth anyway, coming to visit us for whatever reason. Greenfield calls them secret agents, and this also, I think, what he's drawing upon, it's very clear. He's drawing upon, the theosophical concept of the Mahatmas, the Ascended Masters, and all of this. So we've discussed this a little bit already. He considers this a sort of priesthood that protects the secret of the divine visitors. So these visitors that are coming, they're like some kind of, divine beings. He is operating on the basis that our planet was visited long ago by extraterrestrials and other entities, and that the priesthood that was formed then needed to be developed to protect the secret oaths, the secret signs, and the ciphers. And they did this. They created all of these secret things to be able to communicate with each other so that nobody else would be alerted as to what was actually going on. So there's this element of secrecy that is highly evident and prominent in this whole idea that he is communicating. Greenfield speaks of the cosmos and our world manifesting out of an ultimate no thing or nothing. And this manifestation, of course, consists of energies or higher intelligences. Now, these energies or entities, he views them as being a mix of what we would consider to be good or evil. And he calls them black lodges and white lodges. So it's not to be confused with ethnicity or race. It's just this pure abstract thing of black being not good and white being good. So, and then of course, the White Lodge is then associated with the Great White Brotherhood, aka the Ascended Masters, that you hear about in the Theosophical Society's teachings. So that's the White Lodge with all the Ascended Masters. And then, of course, the Black Lodge is then made up of entities that are holding back human evolution and keeping a slave mentality in place, in his words. And he puts Men in Black in that group too. So now the Terry Wrist connection is that Allen Greenfield claims that he interviewed Terry Wrist, and Terry Wrist told him that there were particular rituals that were taken from Thelemic practice. Actually, the rituals are very ancient rituals that are taken from Coptic ritual magical papyri that were in modern days through like Thelema and the OTO were reworked. And this ritual is called the headless ritual or the bornless ritual. And this magical ritual that Terry Wrist is talking about is that this is like the ultimate ritual that you can do to protect yourself against the entities from the Black Lodge. So in my opinion, I'm not going to go into any more detail about this because I've already talked a lot, but in my opinion, this is a culture at its finest. Because you've got all of these different people from all of these different groups included in the mix, and that now, UFOs are also included in this, and how people can protect themselves using ceremonial, ritual, magical practices, I think, is the ultimate. So this blew the Hellier team's mind, of course, because they're like, what are you talking about?
Right.
So that's kind of the recap. So how does this relate then to your case study?
Well, thank you for that recap. It's quite interesting. Also, my only follow-up would be, did they then perform these rituals in the show or something like this, or no?
No, not that. No, not that one, because they don't know enough about it to be able to do it. These are very highly highly advanced rituals. So, and because they were not familiar with this at all, I think a lot of this went over their head. And this stuff that I was telling you about, this ritual, actually was in the book. And I don't remember if Greenfield actually said anything to them about it. They did read the book, though, so they were familiar with what Greenfield was talking about.
I see.
So
then he just the show kind of continued after that. Ona.
Yes,
Greenfield.
they were trying to do other types of experiments. They were using God helmets and other. Oh, shoot, now I can't remember the other name of the other type of experiment that I'd have to go look through my notes. I will include that in the program notes to tell you, because I can't remember it right now. I have to go look that up. But they were trying to do similar types of altered states of consciousness experiments to try to communicate with whatever entity that kept sending them all of these clues or they felt were clues, and trying to get answers that way, because they're not ceremonial magicians. So they were using other more, I guess, contemporary methods. They were
more science, it sounds like, a little bit, or something.
Yeah, I would say alternative types of scientific experiments. Yeah, I'm not quite certain the validity of like a God helmet in the context of using it within a paranormal setting, but it is similar in the sense that you have like a Society for Psychical Research looking into events that happened within spiritualism.
Right, and trying to do it from a scientifically credible way, at least in their eyes. But then you have people in the brick building down the street meeting together at midnight doing it this other way through rituals, right? Yeah, thank you for the recap. It's quite interesting. I just watched literally the episode before we started, and it was striking. This divide between them was quite apparent. That was also interesting in and of itself, where you had these two, like ghost hunter technology, into following like urban legends type vibe, and then you had him who has this whole background in all sorts of occult intrigues and rituals and so on, and study and so forth. So he seemed to be telling them, like, these numbers you're getting, this world of weirdness you're entering into is preparing you for an initiatic process to sort of initiate you into awareness, of what's beyond the veil, which is what's beyond the veil, and all of this stuff we're talking about. This whole other interpretation of reality that involves interaction with other beings and higher, so quote unquote, higher and lower, maybe frequencies or levels of evolution or something. So even that was quite interesting for me, just looking at the I don't know if it was dissonance, but it was funny to watch the two backgrounds trying to, discuss this thing.
Definitely a tension there, because they didn't know anything about Greenfield. They didn't really know who he was until they met with him, and then they started to kind of dig a little deeper and find out.
But I do think it's a perfect example, actually. And two things that I thought about it in terms of what you were talking about is, this whole thing about the white hats and the black hats that you find all over in these conspiracy stuff today.
Yeah.
Never had thought that this is the same, because I wrote a paper about nationalism in World War One, which was all this thing, that people accusing other nations of working for either this white or black lodge. It's like we have the same thing now. It's just hats instead of lodges, apparently, or something. And I never made that connection until right now. It's kind of something interesting. But the other thing about it, though, was there's, and you just said it, and maybe we should just sort of make it more, the picture more, emphasize it more, that even now there seem to be two approaches to this thing. There is the more attempting to be credible in the scientific, governmental, intellectual, authorized intellectual realms to study a phenomena that, as we said before, is stigmatized for a very long time, but is now gaining some kind of traction, as I tried to point out in my presentation. So you have this approach in which also esotericism and ufology are, as I pointed out with Hynek, are connected, actually. So you have that, and then you have this more occulture aspect of it, which is like a more practical, more practitioner world in which these ideas are much more malleable, and it's a creative process for involved in experience and so forth. But they're also making a link. So it's sort of interesting here. We can see that in both cases, we have just kind of two examples of a more, more authorized, quote unquote, authorized approach, and then the more, maybe we can just say scholar practitioner or something. Well, that's not quite right, but something like that. Two different approaches to this same thing, but the presence of esotericism and with the UFOs is, you can find it in both. But when I looked up this whole thing, just to think about this, that these two worlds are also blurring in a certain sense. It made me think of, there's this one group called the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. I don't know if you've heard of this before, but they are, the guy who runs this thing leads retreats. And on these retreats, the way you have an experience of a UFO is through group meditation. So you do a group meditation ritual, basically, and it's supposed to summon. These are called UFO summonings. Maybe you've heard of this. They're not summoning.
Sounds familiar. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just this group. This is another area which is perhaps forming. Maybe will become more of a thing. I don't know, but UFO summonings are also an interesting part of this, because there you have this ritual magic of summoning, but you're not summoning. It's just like you're still summoning something. It's just the whole, whatever it is you're summoning, it's not a quote unquote demon or angel anymore. It's now this piece of technology in the sky,
Right. No, yeah. There are people yeah, I have heard of this. There are people that are trying to, through, like a meditation, group meditation, to try to get, actual objects, that they can actually see objects. Yeah, I have heard of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's necessarily there's still the scientific realm. Scientists are studying this, or academics. I don't know if they would go down there. They might already be there a little bit. I'm not sure, but it's it's just another. It's somehow in the middle of these two things. Is all I want to point out. Just summoning of UFOs. It's not done within an occult initiatory, process. But it does involve, summoning. So that was another thing I wanted to mention. But when you look up some of the background of Greenfield, there were two other people that he was connected with, who in the history of ufology. One was someone named, and of course I'm not an expert on ufology, so some people who study ufology know all of this, so this is more newer to me. This aspect of it. So it was, okay, good. So one is Gray Barker. He was a writer also who wrote about paranormal and UFO things, 50s and 60s, and then and so forth. But he was sort of, part of this ufology scene, and he was apparently the person who started writing about this Mothman thing that you mentioned too. With John Keel, that he was sort of writing about this first, and then Keel picks it up later. And there was another individual named James Mosley, And I think in the interview, Greenfield mentions both of these guys. And he was also, this James Moseley was also involved in ufology, writing about UFOs and so forth. They were also connected to Greenfield, back when they were sort of a sort of different era of ufology, we would say, maybe old school. I don't know.
Okay.
But what I found interesting about that is, and this is why it's also interesting he's in the show, because that show was like, is it a hoax? Is it not? Is it real? Or is it like a breaking the fourth wall type thing? Or what is it? It's like, but both of them were involved in various hoaxes. It was sort of like they were doing hoaxes, this trickster hoax thing with UFO phenomenon, and perhaps even this Mothman thing. Greenfield was also connected with them during some of this, so it was like part hoax but part real too. And this is the trickster element, which when the show comes on, it's called Trickster, right? Yep. That episode at least.
Yeah.
And it's related to also already this background of this trickster element of esotericism. And this brings us all the way back to the theme of that conference that I presented, that about tricking, magic, secrecy, revealing, all of that. And so I don't know if those other two were interested in the OTO or occult. I haven't read that much, but they were, friends, I think, with Greenfield. So It's just an interesting part of this whole story. Links to the history of New Age occultism, even Thelema here we're talking about. So, there's a really interesting, for me, thread there about esotericism and ufology that could be pressed on more, and people could write about this, I think, and it'd be interesting to learn more about how these things are functioning together, both in a cultural, social process, but also religiously, like an enchantment,
Yeah. Definitely, not to keep using the same word, but it is definitely evolving from a source. We can, like you said, we can find this red thread that's running back throughout history of, where are these ideas coming from? But I think what's it's changing, the stories, the narrative, the context, like the package, how the story is told, all of these things. This is all changing as time goes by. But it's also, as far as studying this, I think this is rather underrepresented. Would you not agree?
Yeah, and I think that, this is being picked up more, and like the notions of occulture, Eric's book about high weirdness, this is like an attempt to try to start even Diana Pasulka's book also. It's an attempt to try, and she's also working now on Rosicrucianism and magic and ufology. So and she presented at a conference recently that was at Rice. That was a really great keynote on this topic. So there are people trying to corral this whole thing, this Skinwalker Ranch, the corrals around it, and make some kind of study of it. Just as an example of like what I, as a religious studies scholar, is like what jumps out at me. And this was happening when I was reading through it was already occurring to me as I was reading through the background of Greenfield and Moseley and Barker. But I, of course, didn't know the whole mythos as you just described it from these books, and I was totally unrelated. I'm working on a different project all about medieval heresies and also heresies in late antiquity, not only in Western Europe, also in Eastern Europe, in the Eastern Roman Empire, or the so-called Byzantine
Uh-huh.
world, all in this Middle Ages period, where you had and in a certain sense still have so many different expressions of Christianity found from so many different sources, and many of those they all fought with it. There was of course, whoever had the most power, and either there was the church in Constantinople or the Latin church,
Yeah.
could quell this. But there was debates, and they fought with each other. And if you read the kinds of ideas of these groups, they sometimes are very similar. It just made me think of some of these proliferation of ideas and groups that thinking about in the modern context of ufology and esotericism, just because in a lot of those groups, these quote unquote heretical groups, you find similar, similar sort of grand worldviews that include elements that are a bit mind-blowing and definitely difficult to be integrated into a more structured doctrine or something. They're a little bit more cosmic in a certain sense too. So just to that's one way that as a religious studies scholar, when I'm reading these things, especially like what you just described, it's like it just reminded me of reading about the belief systems, to the extent that we know them, of many of these heretical groups through history.
Yeah, and I think that again, like what you're talking about, you're talking about these conflicts that these groups are having with particular ideas, and whatever narrative is, the endorsed one, that's the one that gets the most traction, and it depends on who's in power, who's got the say so. That's what you're going to hear more of, and it's going to be around you more. And I think that we can also kind of link that to the New Age and how this narrative about UFOs came about. At first, it was all kind of scary, dangerous. What's happening, and even you see this in popular culture of that time with the films. These were all very hostile. Entities coming to Earth to try to destroy us or enslave us, and you had that type of narrative. Then it started to change, and I think that's what you were probably getting at with kind of the heyday, when you had all of these channeled messages coming through from either aliens or whatever you would call these entities, and it started to become more of a positive thing. And then there was this tension because you had both narratives kind of floating around at the same time. Even someone like Whitley Strieber, who started out with his narrative about the others, as he calls them, was a negative experience, very traumatic, very frightening for him. Even his narrative changed at a certain point when he started to introduce ideas and concepts that had to do more about spiritual growth and about rising to your higher potential and your higher self, and that there were lessons that people could learn from these experiences, and it took it out of that scary abduction. They're harming me, they're doing experiments on me, they're hurting me, they're implanting me with things, it's making me sick, whatever, those types of narratives. And you have that also within this whole hybrid thing as well. You have good hybrids and you have bad hybrids. You have the hybrids that are here for nefarious purposes. So there's always this tension that seems to be existent in the popular culture, I guess. The narratives that are kind of swimming around that people are hearing about. It's either, it's never just one thing. But I think that's also that even in the esoteric literature, there's also that tension. Because there are these forces that are good forces, bad forces, however. We were kind of joking about this before we started recording the interview. What is it that we're actually trying to say here? What's the point to all of this? I think we've made a good point already that this is not new. This goes back a lot, further back than what most people would imagine. But is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, well, I said it was an exploration. That's the way. This was an exploratory interview.
Exactly.
But nevertheless, we did sort of, make some points, I think, or at least made some things clearer than I had them at originally when we started talking. And what you described about this shift between, yes, they're evil, hurtful versus they're helpful, benevolent. You can find that now in because now that this quote unquote UAP thing is being more and more incorporated into a kind of mainstream discourse and governmental policies, even defense policies, like even there, you still are going to find this tension between, is this a threat or is this, a beneficial? So I think it's still there, actually. So I think maybe it's a good way to wrap it up, that we're, there's a phenomenon, there's a sort of sub-narrative within this current moment that we're experiencing around the UFO, UAP, which has a history,
Right. And for the sake of this discussion, we are removing ourselves from any type of judgment of whether or not this is a real thing, or if it's a hoax, or if it's just a figment of people's fantasies or things like that. We're not dealing in that type of discussion in this conversation, and I don't really think that adds anything. It doesn't add anything to the value of the discussion, because if you're just going to talk about something and say, well, it's all fake anyway, it doesn't matter. That doesn't really add anything. So just to make it clear to the listeners out there, we're not making any value judgments on any of this or any of the people that we're talking about. That, there is this tension, as you mentioned earlier, that even the people that are involved in ufology, they are accused of being hoaxers. They are, of being, scammers. And I think that is probably, given the nature of the subject matter, I think you're always going to have that. But for our conversation purposes, we're not entering into that area. So just to make that crystal clear for anyone who might be wondering what our own personal opinions of it, both of us, we are interested in, as Aaron said, the weird. We like to look at this, and whether or not you can prove it one way or the other, that's for the sake of this exploration, as you put it, Aaron. It's irrelevant. We're just looking at the ideas, and we're looking at how these ideas are traced through time.
And with an open mind, I would say, too.
Keeping an open mind, just like I said before. It's this, yes, for some people, this might be a little difficult to take in. And for other people, it might not be. It might be, this is, I know all about this stuff. This is great, So, I hope it, but I hope it helps, in any case to, add to the discussion and maybe even trigger some new discussions coming out of this, so.
Absolutely.
But there was one other thing that to kind of shift the discussion in a different direction. After your presentation and during our really wonderful discussions at the conference, we were talking about the difficulty and the challenges that scholars within academia who want to explore these controversial or quote unquote stigmatized areas, what you're facing, what you're dealing with as a researcher in all of this. Also including the backlash that you get as a scholar, that you receive outside of the academic community. People who are, listening or reading what it is that you're producing and, not agreeing with it or feeling threatened by it or whatever. Could you share more about the things that you've had to deal with, and if you have any ideas on, how we could perhaps start to change what's going on within academia right now?
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to this too, because this will, I think, also kind of help showing why are we talking about it? Why are we taking this open-minded approach and so forth, and yet wanting to talk about it. And maybe I can go back to two things I mentioned at the beginning. This article in the New York Times is now, there's a debate around this whole trajectory post this article and the development in ufology. But nevertheless, this article gave some kind of legitimacy to talking about and studying this subject. And so that is certainly something I want to see. This is, for me, it is very interesting and also, important because part of my work is about reenchantment and the limits of science and things like that. And so I am interested in challenging the secularization narrative. And I'm also indebted here to another one of my colleagues, Hussein Agrama. He's also written about this, and he's an anthropologist, and he wrote an article that people could look up about post-secularity and the UFO phenomenon, where he makes this point that this is why it's important is because it's the biggest elephant in the room challenging this notion of post-secularity. And that's why it's worthy of study. And he says other things beside that. But that particular point was really influential for my thinking, because he's right. It's a good way I am interested in challenging the narrative for a variety of reasons, not least of which is because it clearly is not what happened. So that's one. So anything that allows scholars to pursue lines of research related to that, I'm very in support of and very thankful for these kinds of things. So that's one thing. But the other thing that I would say is also to go back to Hynek, because both Hynek and Vallée were scientists, PhD, and they were interested in this topic and in esotericism. But in the diaries, it's revealed through their conversations that, Hynek especially didn't come out and talk about any of this, especially then, because he was worried about his reputation as a scientist. So that's, I think, another problem. That even now, like if you have to do quite a dance if you want to be taken seriously, but also have a couple publications on your CV about UFO, or like me, like about Mandela effect or something. How is this going to be? Interpreted by whoever you're asking for a job from, or a project? You want funding for a project? They look at this and your project's out the window or something.
Yeah.
So that's another reason why this area is so difficult, and why when this article came out, people jumped on it in perhaps a way that seemed to others like, why does this article just being, because it's the New York Times, and it's like, okay, I'm not saying this, I'm linking to the New York Times. If you're going to challenge something I'm saying, go challenge the New York Times. That's much more difficult move for someone to make. So I think that's another part of it. But personally, I of course am worried about it a little bit, but I don't have a career at this point, so I don't really care that now. But other people, I can see why they would care. I still care a little bit because I want to work in academia. But I've already dealt with this to a certain extent with the history of esotericism. Like my advisor was Dr. Alison Couder, so she has been writing about esotericism. For forever, she wrote her dissertation on the connection between Leibniz and Kabbalah. And she told me stories about how just, real harsh negative reaction she got from these, mostly predominantly male, like historians, in Europe that just wanted to really reject this whole thing. And so, I'm coming in another generation where it's much more, I can talk about this in academia, but her whole trajectory, her whole career, it was a real fight, to even be able to talk about this and be taken seriously. But and it still exists, even though, yes, there's the field of esotericism, it's still, you can be seen as somehow, it can be, not taken seriously, or also as a grounds for, not funding a project, not taking someone seriously, and so forth. So I experienced it a little bit with that, but what was interesting for me, just a personal anecdote of trying to write about the UFO subject. This is not something I wanted to write about ever necessarily, even though I was interested in it. I followed it only because of the Steiner Hynek connection, which was fascinating to me. As soon as I tried to start writing about it, because, this is a thing that's ongoing, and maybe it's because I'm a historian in a certain sense, but now we're writing about things that are currently happening and people who are still around, who have legacies, who
Mm-hmm.
it was, I think it was that, but also there's like this other connection, especially to governments and yeah, like intelligence and government and defense, sort of defense. Like there's that whole government element to it. Then there's the whole group. This whole thing is a field that's outside of academia for so long, this ufology, and it has its own identity out there. You know, it's separate. So as soon as I tried to start writing about it, I just was like suddenly aware of how many like landmines I could step on in every direction I wanted to go. Is what it felt like, you know.
Yeah.
I nevertheless attempted to write it, and I'm still working on it. But I think it adds a whole other element. Yeah, it's a very difficult thing to write about. And of course, if you were to interview Diana Pasulka, she wrote this book about it that was really, in a certain sense, groundbreaking. But she has also had all kinds of difficult experiences, I think, in relation to it. You'd have to ask her. But so even that's published with Oxford University Press, this book. So I guess that's what I would say to it, that it's important, and yet it still feels difficult to write about as a scholar.
Right. There's this sense of trying to find legitimacy in many areas of kind of the little, even esotericism is kind of fringe in and of itself, but even the fringe areas within esotericism, you're trying to find some type of legitimacy for what it is that you're wanting to research and write about. And that can be very challenging, especially if you're in areas that, a lot of people don't even take seriously and think that it's, even happening. They think that it's just more of a fantasy, or, mental illness, or, there are all these other explanations and labels that can be placed on them. And also, you're thinking as your own person, you're thinking, I'm not only engaging in territory where there's a lot of threats to me, but I'm also considered a threat by being the outsider writing about this, that, people might be quite sensitive about it, or they might not like what I have to say and the tone that I use, or, they might think that I'm, being disrespectful, or, whatever it may be. They might, misunderstand what it is you're trying to say. And that can cause a backlash for you then, that these people are going to, come down on you and, try to quote unquote cancel you or something. Not that I don't know if that really plays a big role in, I don't know if maybe it does play a big role in academia about being canceled, the threat of being canceled. I'm not certain, but because I'm not in that area of academia.
Maybe having your funding canceled.
That type of thing. I'm not in that area. Yeah. I'm not asking to get funding or something like that. So that's not, those aren't my experiences, but I can imagine that, that's also a threat, and I find that to be so, on the one hand, so strange, because isn't that the whole goal of, the whole idea of studying something? You want to study everything. You want to, you're curious. You're seeking knowledge about something. But you have to dig into it. You have to find out what it's talking about to, sort it all out. And that's what research is about. And you're not making any, as a researcher, in my case, I'm not trying to make any value judgments. I'm just trying to figure out what's going on here and where does this all come from. So, why would that be discouraged? I find that kind of a weird thing.
Yeah, that's one of the weird things about especially the ufology. Of course, other scholars have pointed this out. Kreipel is the one who started to try to work on this, And maybe it's just the history. I don't know. But there is definitely something about that subject in particular, which is quite difficult. Maybe it's all the Hollywood stuff that's been layered on. I don't know. But there's something about that one in particular that's a difficult one for sure. Although, like I said, I think things are changing, but in what direction they're changing, we'll just have to see.
Right.
I thought that, after the aliens do finally show up, then we can have another show and then it'll all be much more clear, right?
Exactly. We'll have some answers. we'll have that empirical side of the story then, right?
Yeah, she will be in another box up on top there on her Zoom telling us all about it.
Exactly. Okay. Well, what I am curious about is, are you going to keep digging into this? Are you going to keep working on this?
Yes, absolutely. I don't know what I'm going to do with it yet. I imagine it'll become an article,
right?
At the very least, on Hynek and Steiner.
Yeah.
I'm focusing historically a little bit for all these reasons that I told you, that feel a bit more comfortable doing that. But as we brought in with the Hellier thing, this could go in much more current. Well, also the thing with the UFO, the UAP subject in the National Defense Association Act and all this. Both that and the Hellier point to, you could really do a very contemporary studies, but I'm sort of focusing historically at first because I feel a bit more able to handle that research a little bit better. So yeah, like there's another religious studies conference coming up soon where the theme is technology and religion.
Oh.
And so I thought this might be another opportunity to present on it again, maybe even from a different perspective. And so hopefully, yes, this will at least turn into an article. Good.
Excellent. I'm happy to hear that because I remember you saying that, I don't know what I'm going to do with this. And maybe it is just kind of, ends up going to a dead end or something for you. But I think there's stuff there. It's just like you said, you just have to feel comfortable with how to approach it and just, let it develop from there. So I'm glad to hear that you're going to keep digging. Well, Aaron, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to talk to me about all of this and to explore all of this.
Yes, thank you very much as well. It was a good journey.
Yes, and I hope that the listeners find it interesting too. Hopefully this will open up more space for questions and comments and, linking the things that we've talked about to other ideas and making different and new connections from all of that. I was wondering where people can best find you if they do have things that they'd like to talk to you about that might not fit just in a little comment section.
Yeah, well, my papers are on academia.edu, so if you look my page up there, you can find my research, or just if you Google my name, you'll find my page at Erfurt, the University of Erfurt in Germany, and my email's on there, and I would welcome feedback, comments, further leads, and so forth, so please.
Great. Well, I will do my best to get as much information as I can in the program notes for people who might be curious to look more in more detail into the things that we touched on here in any case. But wonderful. I'm so happy to hear that you're going to continue, and I'm looking forward to all of the new things that are coming from your side. And let's keep this line of communication open.
Let's do it. And thank you as well. And best of luck with the podcast.
Thank you so much. My thanks again to Dr. Aaron French for this really fascinating discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. I think we succeeded in opening up a space for exploration, and I hope that you, dear listener, will feel motivated to give me some feedback about it. What are your thoughts? Do you have questions? Please let me know. You can also contact Aaron directly with questions or comments. Just check out the program notes for the links. I have a new spotlight interview coming up with Kevin McLaughlin from Trans States. Some of you might have noticed that I made some blog posts about the most recent conference, and I talked with him recently about Trans States, the history, the concept, and what's to come. That will be on YouTube sometime in December. I've also got a few other things lined up, but I'm not quite certain when it will all be ready. So please stay tuned for more to come. Okay, be well, everyone. And as always, thanks for listening.